Hi guys. Today we're going to actually solve by completing the square. So yesterday we really just practiced how to complete the square, how to create a perfect square trinomial. But today we're going to use that process to solve a quadratic equation. This is our third method of solving. We have in the past learned how to solve by factoring and solve by quadratic formula. So this is just an alternate way of solving a problem. I'm going to run through an example. I'll show you the steps, and then we'll do one really difficult example because I can't guarantee you that the Delta Math problems are going to be easy. And so I made sure that we aren't going to have any really difficult problems on our worksheet homework, but I want to make sure that if you come across a difficult one on Delta Math, that you are capable of doing it. But let's start with this one, okay? So we're going to solve by completing the square, which means that we are going to create a perfect square trinomial. When solving by completing the square, this is the only method where you actually don't want the problem to equal 0. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to move the constant to the other side. And what that'll do for us on the left-hand side is it'll create that gap, that plus blank space, where we can complete the square. Because negative 12 is not completing the square. It's negative, it doesn't have a square root, like we don't like the number negative 12. So on a completing the square problem, the first thing you're going to do is move the constant to the other side, and in its space where it was, you're going to put a blank spot. And that's where we'll do our completing the square, is over on the left-hand side. Now, since this is an equation, whatever I do to the left-hand side, I have to do to the right-hand side as well. That's what will keep it equal, right? When we moved the 12 over, we technically added 12 on the left and added 12 on the right. And on the left, they canceled, and on the right, it became a 12. And so when I put a blank space on the left side, I have to also put an identical blank space on the right side. For completing the square, you're just going to focus on the trinomial on the left-hand side. Yesterday, we practiced this. This was our whole lesson yesterday. So we're going to square root the m squared. We're going to square root the blank space. We're going to times it by 2. We're going to hope it equals the 4m. Actually, we're going to force it to equal the 4m. So m times 2 is 4m. And then we're going to square that to get it up here. So up in that blank space, we're going to write a 4. And then we also need to practice the factoring part from yesterday, because that left-hand side, we're actually going to factor it into the parentheses squared. So this is also from yesterday. So m plus 2 squared is what the left-hand side is going to turn into. And I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, okay? Now, I said earlier that whatever we do to the left side, we have to do to the right side as well. So if I decided to add this random 4 on the left-hand side of the equation, I do also have to add a 4 to the right-hand side so that it stays balanced, so that it stays equal. So whatever you put in the blank space on the left side, put it on the right side as well. And I am going to simplify the right side now. So 12 plus 4 is 16. Okay, next, I'm solving for m. I'm trying to get the letter m by itself. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get rid of this square. And the opposite of squaring something is square rooting it. So I'm going to square root both sides. Now, when you square root the left-hand side, the square and the square root just cancel out, and you'll be left with the m plus 2 that was underneath it. When you square root the right-hand side, since this is an equation, we have to take into account any number that could have been squared and turned into a 16. So maybe it was 4 squared. 4 squared is 16. But we also have the possibility of it being a negative 4, because negative 4 squared is also 16. So when you decide in an equation to square root both sides, on the side that had a number, the side that did not have the square, you're going to need to put a plus or minus sign, because positive 4 squared is 16, but negative 4 squared is also 16. So when you're solving, if you are in the process of solving a problem and you chose to put a square root sign into the problem, on the next step down, you have to put a plus or minus. And this is where your two answers are going to come from. So don't forget, all of these problems always have two answers, and it's going to come from that plus or minus sign from your square rooting. If the square root is already in the problem, like we were doing the square root problems earlier, and the square root was part of the initial question, then you don't put a plus or minus sign in it. It's only when you are choosing to put it in the problem. All right, I'm very close to getting a final answer. I'm actually about to get the letter M by itself. So to get the letter M by itself, I'm going to minus 2 on both sides. Now, when you minus 2 on this side over here, you can't subtract it from the 4 because we don't know if the 4 is a positive 4 or a negative 4. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 2 and we're going to just put it right in front of the plus or minus sign because that's the most natural place for it to go, the least confusing place for it to go. In fact, this is now looking very similar to what our quadratic formula problems look like, where it has a number plus or minus another number. Okay, so when you're moving the constant to the other side, stick it just right in front of the plus or minus sign. And I subtracted the 2, so it's a negative 2 on the other side. Now, in this problem, since those are both numbers and there's no square root symbols in the problem right now, I can keep going. So much like our quadratic formula, I'm going to split this into two problems, one of them using the plus sign and the second one using the minus sign. And my two answers for this question are 2 and negative 6. Just to recap on the steps, and I'm going to go through them quickly and then you can pause and write them down. First, you have to make sure that the number in front of the x squared is a 1 because we haven't learned how to do completing the square if the number in front of the x squared is not a 1. In fact, I won't ask you to do a problem if the number in front of the x squared is something other than 1. Next, take your constant, the number without a variable, and move it to the other side. And in its place, leave a blank space so that you can complete the square, which is the next step. When you're completing the square, make sure to add the same number on the left side and the right side. So you're adding a number on both sides of the equal sign. Once you're done completing the square, you should have a factored parentheses that is being squared equal to a single number. You'll square root both sides, putting a plus or minus sign in front of the right side, and then you just keep going until you're done. Again, if you need to write down these steps, pause the video because I'm going to move on to that second really tricky example. Our second example is especially tricky because there's a number in front of the y squared, which I said we're not going to do. So we need to get rid of it. If you have a number in front of your y squared or your x squared or whatever variable squared, we can't do the problem. So I do need to get rid of this 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything, including the 0, by 2. Here's another reason why this problem got a little bit tricky. I've got fractions. Now we are going to leave it a fraction. We're not going to make it a decimal. Fractions are actually going to work out in our favor. So let's leave it a fraction. For my next step, I'm going to move my constant to the other side. So I'm going to add 5 over 2 to the other side. And in its place, I'm going to put a blank spot. Now, it's going to get more tricky here because the number in front of my y is a 1, which is an odd number. So again, we're going to have to deal with more fractions. For this problem, if I square root the y squared times 2 times the blank space equals the 1y, for right here, I'm going to get a fraction 1/2. 2 times 1/2 is 1. And then when I square 1/2, right, we square the top number and the bottom number, so that becomes 1/4. And so my parentheses squared is y plus 1/2 squared. And then I do need to add the 1/4 to the other side as well. Just a refresher, when you're adding fractions together, you need a common denominator. So I multiplied the first fraction by 2 to get 4 for my common denominator. And now my other side of the equal sign is going to turn into an 11 over 4. All right, now that we have a parentheses squared, my next step is going to be to square root both sides. And on the left side, right, these cancel. On the right side, you can't square root 11 because it's prime, but you can square root the 4. So what'll end up happening is the square root sign will stay around the 11 on top of the fraction, but on the bottom of the fraction, it's just going to become a regular number 2. Okay. And so here again, I can't square root the 11 because it's prime, but I can square root the 4. So I have a square root of 11 on top of a fraction and then a regular 2 on the bottom. And then don't forget your plus or minus sign. Next, I'm going to take the positive 1/2. I'm going to subtract it to the other side. And when I do that, I put it right in front of the plus or minus sign because that's the most natural place to put it. Now, if you get to this point where the letter is by itself, and there is still a radical after the plus or minus sign, then you're done. You don't have to do anything else. So any problems that have a radical still in the question, as soon as you move that constant to the other side and you have a number plus or minus something with a radical, that is your final answer. It looks very different from our quadratic formula answers, but that's what it should look like for completing the square. Now, normally it's not going to be like this. It's going to be more like 1 plus or minus the square root of like 2 rad 11 or something like that. So that's what it'll look like on your homework. But again, just in case this shows up on Delta Math, I wanted to make sure that you saw at least one example of this. This concludes today's video. Tomorrow, I'll go over the other 2 types of problems that you can get with completing the square, which would be when you have an imaginary answer and when you have a double root. So we'll go over those 2 tomorrow. And then that concludes our lessons for this chapter. So don't forget, our test is coming up next week. So make sure that you're getting caught up on all of your homework.